So I'd like to just do a couple of things in a true sort of Kiwi style to open us up before we get down to business. So the first is I'm just going to introduce myself. So kia ora tātou, I tipu aki o ki te Waipounamu, ko aurake te manga, ko pukaki te roto, nā ko Ngāti tau iwi, te iwi, kei wahi whakaro ahau, e mahi ana, ko Peter Harrison ahau, kia ora. So for those of you who are not from New Zealand, what I just said, it's a pepeha, which is a traditional Māori introduction. It's about connecting yourself with other people. And I talked about that I'm from the South Island of New Zealand. That's where I grew up. The mountain that inspires me is Aoraki Mount Cook. And below Aoraki is a beautiful lake, Lake Pukaki, which is a lake that I connect to. My tribe is all the other tribes that are not Māori. I work here at Wahi Whakaro or ThinkPlace, and my name's Peter, so thank you very much. The other thing I'd like to do to sort of open in a customary way is to recite a Māori karakia. You could call it a prayer or a poem, or just a bit of inspiration. So I'll say that in Māori, and then I'll give you the English translation. So whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā tara ki tai. Ehi, aki ana, te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hohu, ti he Māori ora. So what that translates to is cease the winds from the west, cease the winds from the south. Bring calm breezes over the land, bring calm breezes over the sea. And let the red-tipped dawn come with a touch of frost, a sharpened ear, and a promise of a glorious day. So I thought that was a perfect setup for this afternoon session. So today I want to talk about a topic I feel is very dear to my heart. It's my favourite four-letter word, and it might not be what you think. So hope. So I was reflecting on what I was going to talk about, and the word hope just kept on coming back to me. So we'll dig into it in just a moment. In terms of how I'm going to structure this talk, I'm going to start with a few psychology concepts and models. So a little thing about me is I know nothing about psychology, but when I was at university studying civil engineering, I had quite an interest in psychology to the extent that I put in an application to take some psychology papers. I had to get the dean's approval, and the dean looked at it and thought, well, how the heck does this relate to civil engineering? So I thought long and hard and came up with an idea that it was actually that I was interested in how humans interact with the built environment, and somehow that was enough to convince the dean to let me study psychology. I probably should have realised at that point that I had more of a future as a designer than an engineer, but that's a story for another day. So we'll start with some concepts from psychology related to hope. Then I'm going to get to the point of this talk, which is why does that matter for those of us who are working in complex systems, change makers, designers, etc. And then I'm going to round off with bringing that to life, which is a few examples which will illustrate that. So a good place to start, always a dictionary definition. So hope, it's a word we use all the time, but it's probably not one we've ever looked up in the dictionary. So it's a feeling of expectation and desire for a particular thing to happen. So there's two key parts to that, obviously. It's something that you want to happen, so a positive outcome. But there's also this belief, the expectation that it will happen. So we're going to pick up on those couple of concepts as we go through. I want to start by introducing hope theory. So Charles Snyder, an American psychologist, lived through the 20th century. He developed this concept, hope theory. So he was one of the earliest psychologists to be studying hope. It's actually quite a new field. He came up with this model, which is what defines hope as having goals or aspirations, having pathways to get there, and having agency or the ability to make it happen or the belief that you can make it happen. And that's actually what drives hope. The thing I want to talk about next is So what's the relevance between sort of hope and optimism? So from the literature I've been reading about this, you get some schools of thought that say, well, actually, it's all about optimism. Hope is sort of the airy-fairy, wishful thinking that people want. Snyder's sort of view is it's the opposite, actually. It's optimism is actually about So for him, optimism is almost a belief that something's going to happen, irrespective of anything else. So it could be just blind luck, it could be factors outside of your control. It's almost a disposition or a belief that a positive outcome is going to come your way. What Snyder talks about is that hope, and as I showed on the previous slide, hope has these other elements to it. So it's not just having a belief that something's going to happen in the future. It's actually having a structured pathway, having a channel that you can see of how you're going to get there, and having the belief that you actually have some control over that. So one of the fields that's emerging in social psychology is that hope. So again, what's the difference between hope and optimism? So a lot of research is now going into hope, and one of the things that's emerging from that is when life is good, when you are experiencing really good times, the correlation between hope and optimism is actually quite similar, and the two are almost interchangeable. Where hope comes into play is when you're experiencing adversity or high uncertainty. Because when life is tough, having optimism, belief that good things are going to happen, but without seeing a clear pathway to get there, without seeing the role that you can play in achieving that, it can actually work against you. It can actually create hopelessness. It can actually create despair. So there's this really interesting field of research which is emerging that hope comes into its own when we're experiencing extreme adversity and uncertain environments. Just as an aside, this was really interesting. One of the areas of research where this came through was actually in sports. And they were looking at sports fans who were supporting a team that wins almost all the time and sports teams who almost lose all the time. And what this graph shows is that the correlation between the two is really high here. There's almost no correlation between the two at the bottom. So let's just hold this point around hope comes into its own when life is tough, when things are difficult. The other thing with it is the intensity of the emotion here is so much stronger in terms of comparing hope with optimism. And so what sits in behind that, so we all know about endorphins. I'm learning about enkephalins, which is sort of in the same family of endorphins. But having hope, actually, it's shown to produce these chemicals. It's good for our mood. It's good for our brain development and so forth. So there's just something really interesting around. You could almost argue the human need to have hope and what that does for us. So that's the context. And you're probably thinking, yeah, so what? What does that mean for us as change makers, as designers in complex systems? I think for me, it's about we're actually ambassadors for hope. So I've been thinking a lot about visualizing new futures, imagining new possibilities. And I think the challenge so we need that, and the challenge with that is if people don't see themselves in that, if people don't see a pathway to that, it can again do the opposite. It can actually create despair, it can create hopelessness. I think for me, one of the big examples of that playing out at the moment is climate change. And we've been talking a lot in the studios here at ThinkPlace around how a lot of the well-intentioned efforts to get people changing their behaviour to think about climate change are actually having the opposite effect. They're actually creating a sense of hopelessness, despair, this problem is too big, there is nothing I can do to change it. So I think there's something really interesting for us as change makers, as designers, as people who are wanting to turn complex systems around to create better outcomes for people. What does it mean to be an ambassador for hope? And what are the practical things that sit behind that? And I think where I've been challenged as I've been researching for this talk is having a picture of a future state, a vision of what the world could be, sometimes isn't enough. And in many respects, that can actually drive the opposite of what we want in terms of despair. So I'd like to move into a few examples that are meaningful to me that I think bring that to life. I only just recently came across this website from the Rockefeller Foundation, so hashtag Solvable. It's essentially a campaign. They're taking some really big problems around the world, and they're running this campaign around essentially it's solvable, or our belief is it's solvable in the near future. They combine two things, expertise about what is possible and optimism to make it happen. So I think what's really interesting with that is, again, they're not just looking at what is the vision for change. You know, we want to solve world hunger. We want to reduce, the rate of HIV, etc. They're not just looking at what the aspiration is. They've got this point around the expertise. So we're assembling the thinking, the ideas, the solutions that create that vision to a pathway for people. So there's a real clear pathway that sits in behind this one. So this one is a little bit closer to home. So Oxfam New Zealand recently worked with an agency in New Zealand called The Workshop, and they created this really great guide. Again, our team in ThinkPlace New Zealand have got a lot of value from this, how to talk about climate change. And so really to my earlier point, this challenge of people seeing despair in climate change, people seeing a lack of hope, and then often when we want to talk to people, we actually worsen that. And it might be because we're talking about the facts and the problems rather than a better way to talk about it. What's really amazing with this piece of work is it gives some advice around how to communicate with these people and with your friends, with your family. But it goes down to the level of detail of things to avoid and things to replace that with. So this for me is a really interesting example of it's not just focusing on the aspiration. The aspiration is we want to stop climate change or turn it back. It's moving into what are the pathways and what's the agency we can give people so that they can see themselves in that, essentially building hope. The third story I want to share is, this one's much closer to home. This is a project that ThinkPlace New Zealand worked on a few years ago. I'd like to call out my fabulous colleague Rose Wu, who designed this beautiful visual of this amazing story. So this was a project that we were undertaking for an urban renewal agency here in Auckland in New Zealand, and because there was going to be a massive change in the community, they were really concerned about the impact of that on the local residents. So they commissioned us to undertake a piece of work to understand the experiences of people living in that community. And I distinctly remember the moment in this project, and this was from about 4 years ago, where a story surfaced from talking to an agency that was working with young people to get them into the workforce. It was like an internship program. And the story surfaced of a young woman who she had just finished school. It was arranged for her to have an internship at what would have been a great job on the other side of Auckland. It was all set up. Her first day arrived and she didn't turn up. And there was a real shock for everyone involved. It's like, well, we've created this opportunity, we've handed it to her on a plate, and she didn't turn up. She didn't have the decency to say she was unavailable, etc. What was great is the people who were involved had the decency to dig a little bit deeper and understand what was going on. And what they discovered is that this young woman had never used the train service. She had never been to the other side of Auckland, which she expressed was full of people who looked very different to her. So there was a culture shock, there was a lack of access, there was just all of this uncertainty around travelling to a different part of Auckland. Her existence had been very local, and we learnt through this project for a lot of people, their radius was probably about 2 or 3 kilometres. All of their family were in that area, their school was in that area, their church was in that area. They had no reason to go out. And so it wasn't laziness that had prevented this young woman from attending her interview, her first day. It was actually the fact that she was overwhelmed with anxiety, just in terms of this quite different experience. So we shared this story, we created this journey which sort of showed the impact of experiences like that with the client. And in some of our conversations with the client, we spoke a lot about this story. We didn't have a lot of contact with the client for the next couple of years, so we had no idea where that had gone. And to my amazement, about a year ago, so this was about 3 years after the project, the general manager of this organisation, who had been our client, is in the newspaper talking about a new program they'd set up for helping young people transition into work. And she specifically spoke of this story. And so it was a really impactful moment for me to realise the power of storytelling, the power of illuminating people's experiences, and what that can actually catalyse for other people. And if we link that back to hope, what this did is it shifted the conversation from an aspiration of getting young people into employment to actually showing the client that there is pathways here. There are a whole lot of quite simple, easy things that you can do to create an ideal program to provide the necessary support to people. And that is now a program I've got running, and it's incredibly successful. So I'm going to wrap up there. I think there's a couple of things I wanted to cover to really wrap this up, and it's really getting down into the detail now. I think as designers, we actually have all the tools we need to show people the pathways to give people agency. And these are just some of them, but things like storytelling. You just saw a good example of that moments ago. Things like prototyping, helping people see what a new experience might be, or a new policy, or a new service. Visualising things, illuminating human experiences, mapping, helping people see processes and opportunities, and innovation horizons, seeing what is possible here, next, and into the future. So these are just some of the tools at our disposal, but I actually think they are tools that help us deliver hope. So my closing remarks are, I think all of us operating within complex systems are actually ambassadors for hope. It's not just creating the conditions for hope for ourselves, it's actually creating the conditions for hope for our colleagues, our clients, citizens, and so forth. And the takeaway is the conditions for hope are imagine new futures, be aspirational, show the pathways of how we can get to those futures, and really importantly, help people see that they have a role in that and that there's something that they can do to contribute. So thank you for that, and go forth and be an ambassador for hope.